Hi there, I'm the Mythkeeper. Welcome back to my channel. This week we're talking about the Dwarves of Pathfinder. We're continuing our series on the Ancestries. We did humans, we did elves, now we're on to dwarves. This week is a very special video. I put a lot of effort into this one, so I hope you enjoy it. We do a little more Tolkien, I go deep on the history of the dwarves, and we talk about all the dwarf subtypes. Enjoy! This week I'm talking about the dwarves. As I mentioned in my elf video, Dungeons & Dragons, and therefore its derivative game Pathfinder, owe a lot to the work of J.R.R. Tolkien. In the case of dwarves, this similarity to that source material is even more pronounced. And that's not unique to Pathfinder either. All across fantasy setting, elves seem the more mutable people. Consider the elves of classic D&D settings like Greyhawk and Forgotten Realms. They are shorter than humans rather than taller. They are often descended or related to fey creatures. They trance instead of sleeping. But dwarves, they tend to be straight Tolkien dwarves. Stubborn, expert craftsmen who love gold and live in the mountains. Consider the elves of the Warhammer fantasy setting. The high elves don't live in forests, they live in marble cities. They wear white and silver with long pointed helms. They deny themselves emotions because the brightness of their souls can affect the world magically when they feel things too strongly. Very unique. But dwarves in Warhammer, they are straight Tolkien dwarves. Stubborn, expert craftsmen who love gold and live in mountains. Consider the elves of Blizzard's Warcraft games. Look at the specificity of design of a blood elf or a night elf with those outrageously long eyebrows. Now look at a Warcraft dwarf. Once again, we are looking at a stubborn, expert craftsman who loves gold and lives in the mountains. Perhaps there's some special power in the innate stubbornness of dwarves that makes them so consistent from world to world, from universe to universe. So let's go back once again to Tolkien and talk about Tolkien's dwarves, who they are, and what makes them unique. Dwarves have a unique place in Tolkien's mythology. To understand this, we have to talk about his creation myth. In the Silmarillion, Tolkien describes a master deity, and he is called Ilúvatar. This master deity creates powerful spirits, lesser deities, to serve him. They are called the Valar, and he instructs a choir of the Valar to literally sing the universe into creation. It's a really evocative and beautiful creation myth. One of the Valar, however, begins to sing his own tune, and this introduces discord into the world. This is the work of Morgoth, the great enemy, who is a kind of precursor figure to Sauron, the Dark Lord whom we all know from The Lord of the Rings. One of the sources of Morgoth's discord was anger that he was not permitted to create a people of his own. In time, Morgoth would eventually corrupt elves, and in doing so, create the first orcs. But that is a corruption, and not true creation. Ilúvatar centers his world around the stories of elves and men, and so they are dubbed the children of Ilúvatar. Of all the free people of Middle-earth, dwarves alone were not in Ilúvatar's original design. Instead, one of the Valar, the god of the forge, the lord of smiths and craft, a Valar named Aule, creates the dwarves in secret. When Ilúvatar learns of Aule's secret creation, he initially condemns Aule, and fears he might become bitter and resentful, like Morgoth. But Aule begs the Lord's forgiveness, and promises him he will destroy his children if he would just be pardoned. Such was Aule's earnestness in his plea that Ilúvatar is moved, and he helps Aule complete his work, and he gives the dwarves the true breath of life. So while elves and men and hobbits and even all the beasts and birds and fish were created by the choir of the Valar at the instruction of Ilúvatar, the dwarves were mostly formed of the will of Aule, whose domain was specialized around craft and hard toil. This gives dwarves a more specific point of view than all the other races of Middle-earth, and I think it's part of this reason that they have stayed more consistent, as other creators have created fantastical worlds of their own. The Dwarves of Pathfinder stay true to this essential mythology. They were created by Torag, Pathfinder's god of the forge, and obey all the implications that stem from that origin. So what does it mean to have craftsmanship and toil be at the center of your being? To understand this, we have to enter the domain of the spiritual. For dwarves, the act of creation is inherently virtuous. What I mean by this is when other peoples think of the qualities that make a person good, they think of things like prudence, temperance, charity. For dwarves, virtues are hard work, dedication, attention to detail. For a dwarf, one can be considered a good dwarf merely because they are a dwarf who makes beautiful things. Dwarves treasure built things because they are showcases of the virtue of the builder. It's as a derivative of this quality that we get the unfair stereotype that dwarves are greedy, or that they love gold. On its own, gold is not interesting to the dwarf, nor is silver or mithril. But all ore has raw potential, and that is attractive. And gold that has been sculpted into chalices, rings, or amulets is truly prized, for it is that virtue of the builder distilled to visible form. Not every dwarf is a blacksmith, but every dwarf is dedicated to a craft, even if that craft is the craft of battle. Most are likely to dabble in a few different crafts, because as discussed, the act of creation is inherently spiritual to the dwarf. When dwarves commit to something, they see it all the way through. It's a rare dwarf that begins a project and then moves on to something else before finishing it. This too is tied to the spiritual connection they feel with the act of creation. Once something is begun, it must be brought to completion. This has an interesting effect on the dwarf psyche. Dwarves have an incredible sense of resolve. Like their love of built things, this has also conferred upon them a slightly negative stereotype, the stereotype of being stubborn. When a dwarf sets their heart to something, it's very difficult to change their mind. They are said to be as immovable as the mountains in which they make their homes. One of the positive aspects of this strong resolve is that dwarves are among the bravest people in Golarion. When a dwarf tells himself that he is going to enter a valley of the undead to retrieve something, it doesn't matter how impossible the task is. The act of verbalizing this commitment has secured his resolve. He'll first die, then turn back. It is for this reason that dwarves make the most steadfast ally for a group of adventurers, a reliable bulwark against the terrors they might face. As you can probably tell from how invested I am in getting inside the mind of a dwarf, I have a special love for dwarves, and I have played a large number of dwarf characters in my days. I find them to be rewarding characters to play, regardless of class and backstory. If you want to play a hard-working, earnest character with perhaps a shade too much bravado, but one that the other players can lean on in hard times, play a dwarf. Now that I've shared some insights into the dwarf psyche, let's discuss the history of the Dwarves of Pathfinder. According to their own myths, the dwarves were forged by Torag in ancient times, and are to this day sometimes referred to as Torag's children. They live and worked in their forges and cities in the Darklands, which lie beneath the surface of the world, fighting against orcs and goblins for eons. These early dwarves followed the dictates of a prophecy from Torag himself to leave their Darklands home and migrate to the surface, a journey that would later be termed the Quest for the Sky. They emerged onto the surface around 300 years after the Earthfall cataclysm, during the period in the surface world called the Age of Darkness. In order to make a mark upon their newfound home and establish an enduring dwarven presence, they built 10 sky citadels, fortified cities, and massive engineering feats. Typically, these metropolis-sized creations were decorated ornately in the dwarven fashion, and contained many murals and depictions of events from the Quest for the Sky. They were almost exclusively of stone, and such is their craftsmanship that time has only slightly worn away their splendor. Although 10 citadels were built in total, only a few have survived intact to the present day, and are still held by the dwarves. In the years following the end of the Quest for the Sky, many of the cities were overcome by the very creatures of the Darklands the stout folk had displaced during their quest, especially the orcs. Some of the surviving sky citadels are Highhelm, located in the Five Kings Mountains. This metropolis remains the center of dwarven culture in Avestan to this day. Kravenkus, located in the World's Edge Mountains, near Taldor. Yanderhof, located in Varisia's Mindspin Mountains. Kragodan, also located in the Mindspin Mountains, near modern-day Nirmathas. Dongenhold, located in Alkenstar. This city is connected by the Bridge of the Gods to Alkenstar City. Cloudspire, located in the Turwa uplands of the western Mwangi expanse. 2 of the original 10 citadels are being held now by traditional dwarf enemies. Koldukar, located in the hold of Belkzen, this citadel fell to the orcs in the Battle of Nine Stones, and today is known as Ergir, the orc capital. Jormungandr. This sky citadel is located in the Wolf Crags, a largely uninhabited section in the northwest of the Whirlwind's Frostmire region. The dwarves here fell to a Duergar incursion long ago, and these demon-worshipping dark dwarves now control the citadel. The last two citadels are lost to history, although some claim that Spiro Sparrow, on the Mwangi Expanse side of the Shattered Range, is a ruined sky citadel. In addition to the 10 sky citadels, the dwarves established several other holds, keeps, and cities. These include the cities of Davarn, Kovlar, which was formerly the great city of Sagorak, Larad, Rolgrimdur, Tagoret, and Tar Kazmuk, all in the Five Kings Mountains, as well as the Glimmerhold in the Mindspin Mountains, Gerdum in the Tusk Mountains, Vishexrad and Bovodport in the Crown of the World, Oetet in Osirian, and the city of Taralu in the Mwangi Expanse. Despite being well spread across the surface, the heart of Dwarvendom has always been Highhelm and the cities of the Five Kings Mountains, so let's talk a little more about them. In Highhelm, in minus 5133, the great Targic Hilgartson, first High King of the Dwarves, established the Dwarven Kingdom of Tar-Targath. This was the most powerful and long-lived Dwarven Empire in the history of Golarion, which united the dwarves into a common culture for over 6,500 years. Just to the north of Tar-Targath lay the nation of Druma, then being warred over by Orc tribes and Kelid tribes. See my video on the humans of Golarion for more information on the Kelid people. The scattered Kelid clans were losing this conflict with the Orcs, but the arrival of an army of dwarves from the newly established realm of Tar-Targath allowed the human clans to drive the Orcs out of the lowlands. After the war, the Kelid clans were left bloodied and dispersed. The dwarves saw the surviving humans as a primitive culture, and while they initially offered them aid, this relationship soon developed into a soft colonization, and Druma was incorporated into the newly formed Empire of Tar-Targath in minus 4890. On 4 different occasions since that initial date of occupation, the local Kelids tried to rebel against the dwarves and claim their independence. The first Drumish rebellion occurred in minus 4866. The second and third occurred between minus 4500 and minus 1200, although few records survive from those conflicts, so the exact dates are unknown. And a fourth Drumish rebellion occurred in the year 113, when news of the thriving human empire of Taldor reached Druma. The fourth rebellion ended, just like the first 3 did, in failure. Then Emperor Hurognar responded by demanding that the Drumish people be denied beards and beer, thereby prohibiting Druman men from growing facial hair or consuming alcohol. Although the edict was repealed on Hrugonar's death, it had by then developed into a formal tradition and a way for local humans to reject dwarven culture. Unfortunately, these rebellions were taking their toll. Moreover, the empire itself was starting to fracture. No king ever came close to being as popular as Targic, or indeed any of the early kings, and each of the great dwarf cities began to want the empire to see things their way. Eventually, the power of Tar-Targath began to wane. And then, finally, after being attacked by an overwhelming orc horde in 1551, the empire collapsed, and eventually it split into 5 dwarven kingdoms of Gardath, Sagorak, Dogath, Grakodan, and Tagoret, which thereafter fought one another in the devastating 5 Kings' Wars, beginning in 1571. Despite the Dwarven Civil War, the various dwarf kingdoms managed to retain control of parts of Druma, at least until the Taldant 7th Army of Exploration swept through those lands, conquering much of Druma in 2133. Dwarven interest in Druma finally ended after the Curse Accord was signed in 2332, which granted Druma full autonomy, and this accord was recognized by both the dwarves and by the Empire of Taldor. The Curse Accord also ended the 5 Kings' Wars and brought about a peace among the dwarves. That peace lasted about 160 years, but then their ancient enemy, the Orcs, invaded the dwarven kingdoms in 2492. One by one the 5 kingdoms collapsed, and their great cities fell to their enemy. The only city to resist was Highhelm. This became known as the Wild Era among the dwarves, and it lasted for almost 700 years. The orcs controlled the Five Kings Mountains, with only High Helm remaining to defend the dwarven civilizations in the area. In 3197, a charismatic dwarf lord named Cadon the Mighty arrived in the Five Kings Mountains, with the aim to destroy the orcs and end their 700-year occupation of the region. After 82 years of war, Cadon defeated the orcs in 3279 at the Battle of Split Mist Pass and founded the empire of Tar Kadurm. The city of Jernishal was founded under the mountains in 3312 and became the preeminent city of the new empire and later its capital. Jernishal's sister city, Razeri Canton, was founded on the surface in 3451, and it became a vital trade center in the region. For 500 years, Tar Kadurm and its cities flourished until the rending of Droskar's Crag in 3980. Droskar's Crag was a dormant volcano, and in 3980 it erupted, destroying Jernishal and its sister city of Razeri Canton and forcing many dwarves to flee their ancestral homelands. This event, which became known as the Rending, marked the beginning of the decline of Tar Kadurm. The last well-remembered king in this period was King Talric the Industrious, but his murder led to another civil war. This war was called the Forge War, and it lasted from 4369 to 4382. This culminated in the rise to power of a theocrat named Father Odric, who dedicated himself to the dark dwarf god Droskar, also known as the Dark Smith and patron deity of the Duergar. Ordric's theocracy lasted for 80 years, ending in 4466, and although overthrown, that calamitous period did well and truly break the spirit of the dwarves, and in the 250 years since, no single dwarf has been able to unite his people in the Five Kings Mountains. The remaining 4 sky citadels are great metropolises, but none can claim to be more than a city-state. No one has emerged with the will, ability, and charisma to reunite the dwarves of Avestan into a single unified people. And that's the history of the dwarves, a once mighty empire, now fractured, with much of their former wealth and treasure buried deep in the mountains they once occupied. Now let's move on from history and talk about dwarven religion and dwarf subtypes. Most dwarves venerate Torag, the god of the forge, although Caidan Caelian, Gorum, and Abadar are also given great respect in dwarf culture. Torag's teachings still guide most of dwarven culture and thought, as they believe he will abandon them should they ever fall slack in their duties. In addition, there is a small collection of gods worshipped almost exclusively by dwarves. These are mostly related to Torag, and are generally not worshipped individually. Torag's relations include Magrim, his older brother, Angrad, his younger brother, Folgrit, his wife, Bolka, their daughter, Grundinar, his eldest son, Kols, the middle son, Trud, his youngest son, Drangvit, Torag's half-sister, or possibly his jilted former lover, depending on the version of the tale. The only god in the dwarven pantheon not related to Torag is the Dark Smith, Droskar, the chief deity of the Duergar. Dwarven civilization is traditionally divided into 3 groups: the Grondaksen, or underground dwarves, who live in cities beneath the earth, the Holtaksen, or mountain dwarves, who live in cities high in the mountains, and the Ergaksen, or surface dwarves, who live scattered on the surface lands. There is also a 4th group of dwarves, not generally considered to be a part of the core dwarven civilization. I am, of course, talking about the Duergar, or dark dwarves. Let's start with the Grondaksen. The Grondaksen tend to be shorter than other dwarves. They have large eyes and sport extensive facial hair that is present even among their women. As they live underground without a natural day and night cycle, Grondaksen dwarves keep a distinct daily clock divided between 12 hours of sleep and 20 hours of waking activity. This 32-hour cycle is known as the Forge Day, as it dictates the cycles by which forges are warmed and cooled. There's also a unique subgroup among the Grondaksen worth calling out, called the Kulinet. These dwarves live in an extensive tunnel network under the nation of Geb. Geb is a nation ruled by necromancy and the undead. They survive here by making their homes in oasis cities protected by positive energy from Gebite necromancy and corruption. Next, let's discuss the Holtaksen. The mountain dwarves are classic Tolkien dwarves. Holtaksen are usually a few inches taller than other dwarves. Their pupils are larger than normal, and they have long hair that is often worn braided. Holtaksen feel a strong need to relive the glory days of the quest for the sky, and are the most militant of the dwarven cultures, often warring against orcs and giants, and stockpiling great stores of treasure won in battle. Most dwarves who live in sky citadels or in the dwarven holdfast referenced towards the beginning of this video are Holtaksen, and most dwarves I've played have been Holtaksen. Typically, when making this sort of character, I use Norse mythology as inspiration for character names, particularly looking towards the mythological names for frost giants, like Gunnlodr or Suttungr, which have a more gluttural sound to them, which somehow always evokes dwarvish for me. Now let's move on to the Ergaksen, the most diverse group. If you want to play a dwarf that doesn't fall into a typical Tolkien mold, this is the group to explore. They descend from those dwarves who scattered across Golarion's surface and intermingled with other cultures, and are defined as a group by their differences from the two other kin, rather than by any strong link between their various subdivisions. Ergaksen cultures include the monastic and atheist Vahird of the eternal oasis of Rahadum, the dragon-worshipping Mbeke dwarves of the Terwa uplands, the bright, multicolour bearded Taralu dwarves of the eastern Wangi expanse, the Pamet, the so-called sand dwarves of Assyrian, and the mercantile Parahin of Kadira. Finally, we have to touch on the Duergar. While most of the dwarves left their ancestral homelands in the upper levels of the Darklands during the quest for the sky, there were many who refused to leave their cities. Those left behind attempted to hold on to their settlements, only to find that their numbers were too few. During the centuries that followed, these dwarves faced constant harassment and attacks from the other encroaching races of the Darklands, and slowly had to abandon city after city. When finally faced with their own genocide, the evil dwarven god Droskar offered them a chance for survival. In return, he demanded their unquestioning devotion. The dwarves had few other options, and accepted this deal, eventually becoming the Duergar. Droskar gifted them with a mastery of magic, and in time they learned to train giant spiders and beetles as mounts. These two developments helped them come back from the brink of extinction and eventually reclaim many of their lost cities. Just as with the Drow, the Duergar exist in the game world primarily to serve as villains. However, it may also be a fun concept to play a Duergar who seeks to redeem himself. And that's all the dwarves in the world of Pathfinder. Next week we're going to be moving on to the small folk, halflings, gnomes, and goblins. If you enjoyed this content today, please be sure to like and subscribe. If there's anything I talked about that you want to know more about, let me know in the comments below. I really appreciate that. In any case, we'll be here next week. Until then.